Okay, firstly and foremost, as the sun sets here, ladies and gentlemen, at Project Inspire 2025, I want to give an unequivocally loud and well-deserved shout out to Torah Anytime, the biggest virtual yeshiva on planet Earth, for disseminating an uncanny amount of Torah wisdom. Okay, so here's what I want to do in the 3 hours that we have. I want to understand, and it's very important for every single person sitting in this room, specifically, not only to understand why Trump won, and I'm obviously going to focus from a Torah perspective, I'm going to focus from sociological perspective and the values that are sacrosanct to Torah and what was happening in America. And then I want to pivot for a second at the end, because it's a Project Inspire convention, and talk about why, in my 33 years of being involved in Victory-Proj, Victory-Proj, and speaking like a Meshuggah around the world, why this is without question the most auspicious time to be able to reach out to a disenfranchised Jew, and why they're more receptive now than ever. Let me just touch on that for a second, and I'll come back to it before the standing ovation. There are 3 major dates or times in the Baal Teshuva movement. So by all accounts, the Baal Teshuva movement started in 1967. Post Six-Day War, there was a global hisorus, a global sort of reawakening, because you had to be completely myopic, you had to be living in La La Land not to see the military victory that we prevailed in 1967. The Six-Day War was it was just stumped every single expert. There's not a chance in the world that you. So much so, if you know the details of the Six-Day War, not one Egyptian jet took off. People say that's amazing. If you really drill down and understand what happened in the Six-Day War, there was a message from one of the Egyptian people who's involved in information from Jordan. They sent the message to Egypt. Had that message been picked up and been understood and been decoded correctly, they would have been ready with ground-to-air missiles. It would have been a disaster. The person who got the message, the Egyptian, obviously this is all Min HaShamayim, did not understand the message and didn't respond, and boom, we flattened every single one of their planes. I can go through multiple stories like that. So that's the first real trigger of the Baal Teshuva movement. Then we see 1973 with the Yom Kippur War. You've got to understand what was happening in Israel. They had ordered tens of thousands of body bags. There was a clear preparation for Rahman al-Hassan, a huge genocide. By all accounts, this was the beginning of the end. And people were dead serious. They thought this was all over. There's absolutely no logical reason to understand how Syrian tanks and the Lebanese at the time, but the real charge was from Syria, their tanks stopped dead in their tracks. Inexplicably. Had they carried on rolling, they would have rolled through Jerusalem. When they interviewed some of the POW, the prisoners of war, they said they had stopped because they saw a whole bunch of Israeli tanks that were it's a complete mirage. It didn't happen. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu clearly, again, in this world, the idea of HaKadosh Baruch Hu really performing an open miracle flies in the face of our Bechira. That's as close to an open nace that you see. Usually it's a nace nigla, which is hidden. So that was 1973. The third hisorus, which we're going to talk about, was 10/7. So for the last many, many years, I've been speaking on a lot of campuses, and I'm on the Harvard Jewish Alumni Association, and I'm on the board of the Harvard Law School Alumni. So I've got a little bit of insight into the Ivy League world. Understand, this is not Ivy League, it's all colleges. Understand what was happening in America so you can understand this, and then we'll talk about Trump and how this comes together. 1967 was a spiritual hisorus, an amazing perception of this. The Yad Hashem has to be involved. There's got to be an author to this world. 1973 was similar. 2023, Simchas Torah was completely different. What happened? Simchas Torah, it was the biggest identity crisis in the history of the Jewish people. I personally have spoken to a ton of people at Harvard, but also elsewhere, where their roommates, their classmates, their buddies on 10/6 were hanging out and having falafels in Harvard Square, and 2 days later they were screaming, "Go Hamas, death to the Jews." They freaked out of their minds. The concept of they screaming the demise of the Jews, death to... Maybe I should find out what's this whole Jewish business. It was the biggest identity crisis, and I can tell you, for those of us who've been around for a long time, the groundswell of people that are re-evaluating their commitment to Judaism is off the charts. You cannot get a seat at the Beis Medrash in Aish Torah in Jerusalem. The same thing with Osamer, Bachashlo, all the Bolshevik, because for the first time, a lot of the half-asleep enemy, which I'm going to talk about, in the college campuses shocked the living daylights out of Jewish students. That was the whole point. Just like in Los Angeles, the fires were not meant stamazai. There's nothing that happens. The Chofetz Chaim said that if a hurricane happens in China, it's relevant to us Jews in America. So the fact that there was a fire in LA within 24 to 36 hours after the biggest public shaming of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the most blasphemous comments, specifically that fire was in Pasadena and Malibu, disproportionate amount of the people in the Hollywood, it's also not Mikra. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is giving us the final wake up before we're holding by lost at love, and there's not too much time left before the coming of the Mashiach. And I can tell you, as someone who speaks a lot on campuses, the age group that I really focus on is Gen Z and millennials. They stunned. They're absolutely stunned. And for the first time, it's cool to be Jewish. It's not only cool to be Jewish, they also realize that the people that are screaming against us have no clue as to why they're doing this. I went back to Harvard, and I pretended that I was a journalist for the Harvard Crimson, which is the newspaper. And one of these nutcases, going around with a kafir on, I don't know how, it's just timing. Obviously, you didn't see my yarmulke. And I just said, it's just interesting. We're trying to get a sense of, what the motive is, why people are involved, in these protests. Maybe it was a more sensitive person, and it didn't happen but once. So he said to me, the truth is, I was hanging around in Quincy, which is one of the colleges at Harvard, pretty lonely. They offered me pizza, we hung out. And you're talking about the most lonely generation. They made overtures to them, and he found heaven, then he found himself doing hakafa, screaming, and he had no clue what, Michael Jordan, Jordan River, no clue. So that's what's happening. That was what's happening before 10/7. I want to go through the following reasons why Donald Trump was voted as President of the United States. And I should just tell you that I've discussed this. I was in Israel with Rav Asher Weiss, with Rav Berkowitz, with Rav Elephant. So people who I think have a insight into what's going on in Inyan Dayoma and Torah sagacity. So I believe everything I'm going to tell you is absolutely the emes. If you really want to know why President Trump became the President of the United States, the 47th President, we're going to go back to the Gemara in Hilchos Nida, in Masechta Nida, and you've got to understand that the idea of every single Jewish child is taught the entire Torah while they are in utero, okay? Which means, firstly, the idea that you get a patch on your lip, that's questionable. But the understanding that every single one of us understands deep within our DNA that there's an instructions for living, that there's a rhyme and a reason for things happening. And obviously, as you begin your life, it's hardwired into you. That's why in the many times that myself and others have taken trips to Israel, and the most disenfranchised secular people stand at the Kaisel, they bawl their eyes out, and they have no clue why. It's hardwired into all of us. That's why, as the Ramchal said in the Hakdamah to Mesiras Yesharim, it's a recognition. People understand, and that from a very visceral level, what's sheker and what's the emes. We went through the most horrific takufa, and I'm going to discuss woke culture and the source of woke culture and why people were not standing up against things that were so insane. You walk into a doctor's office in LA, there's 26 options of agendas. You can identify as a frog. How can people think this is normal, right? So why were people quiet? I'm explaining to you what happened in terms of this was extremely well thought through. Where the cameras are rolling, so I'll try and be nice about this. But my former classmate at Harvard Law School, who sat 2 seats away from me, got involved in politics. His name is Barack Obama. I don't know if you Google him, you might see. Even in those days, it was very clear to me and others that he was beyond radical. Ami Magazine, this is as an aside, when Ami Magazine reached out to me and they said, Rabbi Gordon, you were in the class of the president, we want to know, that's how geschmack it was, what the whole experience was. I actually had to ask a shaila whether I should tell the truth. So one of the biggest poskim in the world, who everyone in this room I think would respect, told me, are you out of your mind? You'll be in a body bag. So you can draw your own conclusions. It's a person from Chicago who was surrounded not exactly by the Mir Chabura, a very dangerous person. And I saw this with my own eyes, and it was very, very difficult to see how, because he's extremely charismatic and he's got an incredible gift of the gab, people just fell for it, and worse, the Jews fell for it. So with that whole thing in mind, point one that I want to underscore is that every single Jew, no matter how disenfranchised, on a visceral, deep level, understands the emes and understands the basic idea of the Torah. So what about the fact that most people in this world are not Jewish? If you look at the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Sanhedrin talks about it elsewhere, the Shiva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. If you look at the 7 Noah laws, I'm going to focus on a few which are germane to our discussion. Do not murder. I'm talking about murder in this context as busha barabim. Embarrassing a person in public is considered murder. If you've ever embarrassed a person, if you've ever seen, God forbid, a person being embarrassed, have you ever seen that the actual the facial color goes white? Your blood. So white is the sign of a person who's met their demise. That's what physiologically happens when you're in shock and you're embarrassed. Busha barabim is like murder. The second of the Noahic laws, do not steal. We're going to talk about the fact that there was actually laws that if you shoplift less than $900, they can't touch you. Just understand that police were told, New York police, the LAPD, stand down. So people were walking in to Best Buys, were walking out with flat screen TVs or whatever, they couldn't touch them. Okay, do not steal. Sexual immorality, we'll talk about the degradation of basic morals. And then do not curse God. We just touched on the idea of what happened in the fires. Okay, so this is hardwired into Jews. We discussed from the Masechta Nida, and in Sanhedrin we understand that that at least 5 out of the 7 of the Noahic laws are relevant to our discussion. There was a silent panic in America. So one of the advantages of being in the public speaking circuit, if you will, is I speak a lot in Middle America. It became very apparent to me during the election that Los Angeles and New York are outliers. That's not a reflection of what's going on in America. We think we live in this big city. The middle of America were chalishing. They were out of their minds. What are you out of? So how did this happen? Because there was a conscious decision by various people to begin a concept called cancel culture. It was vicious, and they knew the only way to perpetuate something that is so irrational, as in woke culture, was to tell people basically that anyone who articulates or takes issue with this, you're done. And they gave examples. They really destroyed people. So you had a bunch of extremely frustrated people seeing the most absurd things. Laws about let's get rid of plastic straws. You can identify as a horse. The middle of America was saying this is absolutely insane. But they also understand that the idea of canceling people was very, very real. I want to go through some of the main salient points because at the end of the day, the reason why Trump won the election, economy aside, this was a referendum on woke culture. Ultimately, this was a referendum on America saying it's binary. You can either go towards this woke culture, and I'll explain what the source of this, or we can continue to live pursuant to the ideals of the founding fathers of this country, who were deeply, deeply religious people. If you've ever seen the logo of the second best Ivy League school, Yale, it's Hebrew. You've got to understand that this is a deeply religious country, and that's where most people are comfortable. When I speak in the South, on the Bible Belt, deeply religious people, they were out of their minds as to what was happening. And there was very clear, let's just say, very clear questionable things about laptops, and it just didn't make sense to people. So here, just understanding the cardinal points of what world culture is about. Firstly, the idea of allowing a minor to undergo drastic and irreversible operations to change their gender. So I'll explain to you what the fallout of this was. That's one example. The idea of there's an oppressor, okay, and then there's the victim. There's basic concepts. If you want to talk about the 3 or 4 legs of woke culture, the one is identity politics. It's not about your ideology. It's about whether you're a man or woman, or you're a person of color, or you're Caucasian. That's the whole concept, and that's what they did to try and take away ideology and say we need more people of color. We don't care if they don't, on merit or not, whether they understand the job. That's what we need, and they started developing very subliminal propaganda as to why it makes sense. It flies in the face even of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King spoke about a dream of meritocracy, that a person who's got the skills and merit, that it's against the most well-known civil liberties in the African-American world. The idea of DEI is insanity. Okay, diversification, equality, and inclusion is one of the most the racist thing. I'm saying this as a South African that I've ever seen in my life. You're basically saying that if you're a white Caucasian male, the chances of you getting certain government jobs was almost zero. Merit didn't mean anything. The entire country ground to halt in terms of the level of efficiency of any federal office. The bureaucracy was filled with people that should never have been there, and people started saying this is beyond insane. Now let me just drill down on what was really happening. What was really happening was the following. It was a conscious attack on the nuclear family. Husband, wife, children. This is a conscious attack on the nuclear family. It was also a conscious attack on the law enforcement and the justice system. And thirdly, it was a conscious attack on religion. If you want to talk about the 3 Olympic rings of what woke stands for, firstly, the nuclear family. There is the idea of having to recognize same-gender marriage. We'll leave that to a side. The idea of everything from the transgender movement to the idea of any kind of confusion about one's gender was a conscious move to break down who is a man, who is a woman. It's in your head, the difference between gender and sex. So I'm going to ask a question, and it's fine with the cameras running, because anything I say, we've definitely corroborated, because this is not what you're going to hear on the Clinton News Network, CNN. What percentage of Americans, hold on to your shade of this, what percentage of Americans do you think were identified as transgender? What percentage of Americans? Was it 20%, 30%? You tell me what percentage of Americans. And understand, this is what I do. I mean, sorry? 10%? Anything else? Okay, we're talking about just over 1% at most. Okay? What percentage of Americans, I'm not saying this with any judgment, I'm making a point in terms of an observation. What percentage of Americans do you think are gay? Now understand, it's all over shus. The idea of having a proclivity to be attracted to the same gender is not a new thing. If you want to talk about transgender and how you're talking about it's also not a new thing. The first being in the world was an androgynous being. So this is not new. But I want you to understand what was going on. Give me a percentage of people in the United States that were defined as gay, meaning attracted to the same gender. Okay, so it's 1.6%, and that is even exaggerated. Now, 1.6% of the population, and I'm telling you that's very much an exaggerated number, were basically driving basic Judaic-Christian ethos, completely against what this country, the founding fathers of this country, and what most people, they were highly funded. I wouldn't want to see what's going to happen to George Soros in the next world, but they were highly funded by people with completely twisted ideas, and I will tell you what people started realizing. Firstly, when you peel back the onion, and as a speaker, I make sure that I get all the data that's up to date. The amount of these kids that made the transition from the blue team to the pink team, or vice versa, that were suffering from suicidal ideation, or who committed suicide, is off the charts. You don't see that statistic anywhere. Do you understand what was driving this? there were institutions and medical clinics that were making billions and billions and billions of dollars. So when we peel back the onion, and you thought this is people who are benevolent, they're concerned, a person identifies they're the wrong gender in the right body. So let me just give you what is really going on. The amount of money that, and I don't want to misquote this, the amount of money that institutions such as, hang on one second, well, I'll get there. We're talking about an industry, okay. Cheddarwood Plastic Surgery Center. I've got the Mount Sinai Center for Transgender Medicine. There's a whole list. They make billions of dollars on decisions where they worked out the law so that a minor was able to make their own decisions. So these kids are obviously getting pounded in social media that it's cool, and if you feel inside, the Torah talks very clearly about that we all have certain proclivities that could be construed as the other gender. So you can imagine a person going through their formative years. This is not done in an altruistic way. This is completely done to confuse people. So that's the idea of the nuclear family. Let's turn for a second to religion. There's one statement on every single dollar bill. In God we trust. They took out, there was in 23 states, you were not allowed to say, you couldn't have the Ten Commandments shown anywhere in a public school. They were consciously trying to take, Lord became a four-letter word. Understand what the thinking was behind this. The thinking behind this, and it was nefarious, and it was not because they care, was the whole concept of you have to rely on us, the government, the big government. Therefore, I don't want to have competition. You can't have a deity. You can't have God because we are God. Woke became a religion. Now, I'm out there and I'm speaking to people and I'm involved in the debates, protests. It was so vicious that it was clearly not just a nice idea. These people, this became their identity. If you take God out of the equation, two things happen. Firstly, the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu wired us is that you have to have some kind of meaning or some kind of purpose. Otherwise, you're eventually going to for sure you're going to have an existential crisis. That's the underpinning of Viktor Frankl, but it's also all over the Torah. You have to have you cannot be in this world and think that you're a hamster on a treadmill, and in the end you go into this box, get eaten by worms and shame. No one can actually be able to get their arms around that. So what they basically, if you take God out of the equation, there goes the opposition to relying on something. And they also clearly, what was underscoring the woke movement was completely antithetical to the Bible, to the Torah. Again, you're talking about family. You're talking about understanding that we are not in control. What is the third thing? So we said they had to go at the nucleus of the family. They had to go at... yes, very good. So I'm going to come to that. So we definitely said the idea of any kind of gender fluidity, that whole drive was a huge financial underpinning. I'm not talking tens of millions. I'm talking about billions and billions of dollars. Race as well. Now, like him or not, my fellow South African, Elon, the amount of fraud, the amount of what they've found in terms of what government money that was directed via sham countries, sham companies, was all directed back into very things that you and I would not necessarily concur with. The way they justified that was also based on, in some cases, that this whole ethos about letting people subjectively determine their gender. There's a ton of money that's gone into this. There was 57 million, I'll give you one example, $57 million into educating transgenders in Libya. There's a list that's it's insane. So money was for sure behind this. Okay, so let's move on. Let's move on and start seeing what the cracks were happening just before Trump was elected. June the 29th, 2023 was a landmark case in the Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court versus, the Students for Fair Activism versus Harvard. It's a very famous case. That was the end of affirmative action. What is affirmative action? Affirmative action means that there's a certain quota of students that have to be either people of color. Now, when I went to Harvard, I would say at Harvard Law School, 38 to 40% of my class was Jewish. Harvard Business School, at least half. Now you go back to Harvard, less than 2% of the law school is Jewish. Completely conscious thing. And the business school happens to be a little bit more autonomous. But it's horrific what is going on. You also got to realize what was happening in terms of the propaganda of woke culture. They got this idea from Goebbels, Yamach Shemor, he should rest in pieces. The propaganda of the Nazi party was the following. Break down morality, which means if you understand what happened before 1939, they flooded Germany with pornography. Flooded. Okay, it's happened, exactly what happened in America. Morality dropped down to the point where it was socially acceptable. People are walking now into the Oscars with no clothes on. That's where we're holding, okay? So you drop the moral degradation. And the second thing, one second. What was my point that I just said before the, I was going to make this, I'll come back to this. So the build-up is, okay, then the only way that they could possibly feel that they could sustain an argument was completely fallacious, and if you speak to people they realize was absurd, was they had to demonize Trump. They completely demonized him. He's a racist, he's this. So I'll give you personal stories. In the previous election, I was asked to moderate a discussion between the editors of all the major Orthodox papers, so Yated, Hamadea, Ami was there, Mishpacha, the current chief of staff, and then it was Jared Kushner and myself. So we weren't allowed, this wasn't for public. The idea was they wanted to tell all the editors of the newspapers an opportunity to give Trump's philosophy and for them to disseminate it. So it was just very interesting. There was no one to impress. Jared got on, and it was just myself and Jared. So he says to me, Chanan, I want to tell you something about my shver. That's hysterical, but he's about Donald Trump. He comes to my house for Havdalah. He's incredibly respectful. He's sitting with his grandchildren. This idea of this guy being a demon. So I'm not here to tell you that they're going to write an art scroll book on Donald Trump. Okay, I'm well aware that he's a very belligerent and he hasn't got a small ego. But in terms of stories that were coming out of them were complete and utter lies. Okay, and obviously over time, what's happened in terms of from the Russian hoax to Stormy Daniels, all of these things have been ripped apart. So they tried the classic thing that, again, Goebbels was you demonize the opposition, you create confusion, and that's how they were leading up. But by the time we came up to the election, there was already a groundswell, and I felt it, of people that were saying it's enough. This is not livable. This is insane. They're breaking down religion. They're breaking down the family. And they're doing it by, again, what Goebbels' idea was they went from the academia down. So they took every single school. This is not just the Ivy League schools. And they started inculcating concepts like critical race theory, like intersectionality. I'll give you just a touch on it. Intersectionality's concept is that basically you are being bullied. You're a victim. We're also victims. And therefore, Shalom Al Yisrael, okay? We should join together. That's why you've seen absurd things. Like, for example, gays for Palestine. Do you understand in the charter of Hamas, it unequivocally says, if you're homosexual, right, we push you off a tall building. The only reason why they were pushing people off tall buildings recently is no tall buildings left. But the truth be said, it was absurd if you stopped them for a second. They were marching for an organization that says, we think you're subhumane, we're going to kill you. That's what intersectionality. Critical race theory, we just discussed, is taking away the ideology, taking away the philosophy of the ethos of the party and making it into man and woman and race, because by so doing, the argument was there's not enough African Americans, there's not enough people of color, and people are then become colorblind to what the philosophy is. They're just worrying about counting, how many people on the board are of this race. Completely absurd. Okay, so reason number one why Donald Trump won the election is America, for sure, had reached a point of fatigue and exhaustion about woke theory. They realized that woke theory was directly impacting the nuclear family, was directly impacting religion and God, and you've got to understand, this is, at the end of the day, this is a Judaic-Christian country. very much a God-centered country. And the third thing was, so the third thing was religion. What did we say? One more point. How do I know, just before we move on to point number 2? The LA Times is not exactly known as the bastion of right-wing conservative writing. Neither is the New York Times, right? According to their own survey, before the election, the Los Angeles Times did a survey, and 76% of their subscribers and readers were basically saying that they're concerned about the family, they're concerned about the future of the country. It was very, very clear that even people that were supposed to be the subjects of this propaganda campaign were saying, must speak. So that's reason number 1 was woke culture had reached a point of exhaustion. And my thesis is that this election was really a referendum on woke culture. Number 2, Parshas Lech Lecha says unequivocally, clearly, very clearly, that those who bless my nation, they will be blessed. Those who curse my nation, they'll be cursed. Unequivocally clear. Let's talk about what Donald Trump, just a few ideas. March 2006, when I become president, the days of treating Israel like a second-class citizen will end on day 1. The IAC summit in 2019, God bless the state of Israel. 2024, September the 20th. You have a big protector in me. We stand in awe of the unbreakable spirit of the Jewish people. Here was the tipping point. If you look at what it says in Dvarim and what all the Mefarshim are saying, is the recognizing of God running the world. What happened after the attempted assassination? He stood up in front of the world at the Republican National Convention and said, I would not be here but for God Almighty himself. There's a non-Jew basically really giving deference and respect to the master of the universe, saying, there's no way in the world that you explain this, but for there must have been a divine hand. There was a number of people who there's a doctor who spoke to me about this, and a bunch of people, that we're talking about a millisecond, and but for that, and he doesn't even know why he moved his head. They would have blown his brains out. It's inexplicable. He doesn't know why he did it. And the fact that he's recognizing HaKadosh Baruch Hu publicly, again, it's very clearly in Sfarim, that person will get a large amount of siyach dishma. Okay. We're going to move into, I'm going to go very quickly past the third reason, because I really don't want to dwell on it. If you speak to people in the realm of Soid, the metaphysical world, which I really don't want to get into, there are a number of theories that came out about Donald Trump being a Gilgal of Esav. But Esav was, as much as he was a wild hunter, he saw ultimately that to combat evil and to bring about holiness. If you really understand what his tough kid was. I don't want to get into the metaphysical. I want to touch on one more thing, which is, and again, I'm not spending a lot of time on this because some people take issue with this. We used to teach the Torah codes. We used to teach the Torah codes as part of our Discovery Seminar. Arachim used to teach it. Whether or not you're a chassid of the Torah codes, it's beyond insane to see what the Torah codes was prognosticating. The way the Torah codes works is using equidistant spacing. They take the letter every 7 letters and basically spell something. And I can show you this if we've got a Torah here. So I'll give you some idea of what they found next to Trump's name. Okay, equidistant spacing. They found threats of murder. They found love of Israel. They found president. They found King Cyrus, and there's a story about King Cyrus. They found Donald. It's beyond, again, it's insane. If you understand statistically the chance of this happening, 1 times 10 to the power, it's beyond insane. So let me summarize where we are there for now. Why did Donald Trump win the election? So number one, we said that deeply embedded in every single Jew, because we learn the Torah for 9 months during that time of his gestation, there's an understanding of basic morality and basic Gutzkeit, and whether or not you become disenfranchised, that doesn't go away. Therefore, when those of us that have been involved in the Kira world for a long time, you never makarev somebody. That's the most ego trip, person does makarev someone. What you're doing is you're peeling back the spiritual soot that lies around the neshama, and they recognize the emes. It's there. That's why in hundreds, thousands of trips that I've done to Israel with college kids, etc., they don't know why their eyes well up and they're hearing it's deeply, I said with regard to non-Jews, at least 5 out of the 7 Noahide laws are directly connected what was going on with woke culture. Clearly, on a deep level, America felt there was something wrong and it was repugnant. How did the protagonists of the woke movement neutralize this? They built up cancel culture, so people were dead scared to speak out about this. We then went on to the fact that it says very clearly in the Torah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, those that bless me, they will be blessed. There's never been a person who's more outspoken in favor of Israel than Donald Trump. Again, I'm not saying he's a Gadol Hador. I'm not saying that he's a tzaddik, and I'm not saying that you should have pictures of the Gedolim and Trump. I'm saying that he's unequivocally and been a friend of Israel against a lot of odds. Then we touched on, I don't want to get into it, we touched on the metaphysical, if you will. There are a lot of theories about that it's clear that Trump's not normal about how direct he is, how inexplicable friend of Israel. He was the first person to tell Hamas, threaten them, saying, if they're not back, all game, set, and match. Not exactly the politically correct thing. So again, if you look at the story of Esav, you look at clearly the indicia of what Trump is, and the Torah codes are touched on. I want to just move on for a second to talk about why this is the most auspicious time in the history of America for us to be reaching out to our disenfranchised brothers and sisters. There are 3, it's a perfect storm, 3 converging circles that are happening right now or have happened in the recent Tekufa. Firstly, we just discussed that the presidential election at the end of the day was a referendum against woke culture. Woke culture flies in the face of any person who's a God-centered person and a person who wants decency and morality. That's circle number 1. Converging with that is you're reaching the point of social media overload. Now, what's happening in social media, and this is the world that I live in, we have a client who's the biggest YouTuber in the world. I think I understand this space pretty well. 2 things. We did some research on what's the number 1 pain point. What's the biggest pain point of Gen Z? What is the point that's causing the wheels to come off? It was clear what the biggest pain point was. Nihilism, meaningless. They have no meaning, they have no purpose, and these kids are in deep trouble. Highest percentage of suicides, teenage suicides, highest amount of anti-anxiety and antidepressant drugs being dispensed, the highest percentage of bulimia, anorexia ever. If you understand Durkheim's work, Emile Durkheim, the philosopher in France, he spoke about a concept called anomie, A-N-O-M-I-E. Anomie means the following. It's a breakdown. It's a breakdown of any sense of gedarim, of guidelines, of values, hierarchy. And what's happened in the world of social media is the following. If you understand what social media is doing, is that all the guys, and I know this because this is the world we live in, every 7 seconds on any app that's well designed, there will be a dopamine trigger. Now, what dopamine does, dopamine and oxytocin, those are the chemicals that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created. Those are the chemicals of pleasure. And that's why the idea of a runner's high, when you release endorphins, it's the concept of it's not just you're interested in the content, you actually become addicted. So there's a real addiction that's happening in America over a period of time. And if you really understand what's going on, is it starts muting the frontal cortex of the brain. The frontal cortex of the brain is where critical thinking happens. So what they've done consciously is to create a generation of zombies. They're complete automatons. How do I know this? It's based on a number of things. One of them is called the illusory truth effect. So the illusory truth effect, if anyone saw my TED talk, is as follows. Well, let's just do it right now. Let's say the word silk. If you've heard this before, just follow along. Say the word silk, S-I-L-K, 7 times together. Silk, 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 silk. And what do cows drink? So cows drink water. Why do most people blurt out milk? Silk, milk. Why? Because what happens, and this is what's happening on social media, is that if you hear something at least 4 times from an ostensibly credible source, your critical thinking gets neutralized and you become completely a zombie. So you've got tens of millions of kids out there that are passive repositories for whatever woke culture was telling them. And they're walking around screaming how wonderful it is to change your gender and they had no clue what they were thinking. I stopped them many times and they had no clue. And that's why I've been on campus tons of times, or Ben Shapiro. When you ask them a question, very nicely, like, based on what are you saying that? They get angry because you're stopping them and you're forcing them to think, and they obviously haven't thought this through. So number one, woke culture is, we take issue with woke culture. Number two, there's a huge generation of people that are zombies that are living in virtual reality. You must understand how big this is. If you take Gen Z and you take millennials together, in the next 10 years, they're going to represent 41% of the consumers. It's a huge demographic. And the people with a very nefarious motive understood that we need to own this generation because that's the future. And they're doing it through social media, and it's one of the reasons why 10-7, the day after 10-7, there was a 50-50 when you look at the Gallup, when they were evaluating the media, so it was about a 50-50 response. Within 3 weeks, for every one positive comment about Israel, there was 7 negative from the other side. How did this happen? That's the power of social media. Iran had acquired hundreds of thousands of bots. So it's a false account. So the way that social media works, it works through an algorithm. They created the idea in the minds of the algorithm that there were tons of people saying anti-Israel things, but they weren't real accounts. By the time they realized they were bots, the media's out. That's the whole point of social media. It's done. That's why the whole time talks about Lashon Hara being a pillar with feathers. If you throw the feathers out, no matter what you do, you're not going to collect all the feathers back. So there was a very conscious decision to create an anti-Israel thing, and they're using these platforms called social media. The most anti-Semitic platform by far was TikTok. And again, TikTok's directed at Gen Z. So we did a whole study on TikTok. It's incredibly vicious. And understand, you are targeting a generation that's not thinking. So whatever they see or hear on these, they take as gospel. I just assume that it's true. So number one, the end of woke. Number two, social media, the development of anime. The last of the Olympic rings is what we saw before the election was the return to religion. 2025. January, when they turned the clock from 2024 to 2025, if you look at what was the number one podcast in America, it wasn't Joe Rogan. The number one podcast, as we turned the corner into 2025, was a podcast called The Rosary in a Year. Christian podcast, and the person who was the podcast host was a priest. What does that tell you? Big move back. Big move back. Okay, so we are done with people saying, I identify as a lizard. We are done with this idea that you walk into a store, take $899 worth of goods, and no one can get you. We're done with this idea of defund the police. Insanity. Insanity. But when you think how consciously what they did, they took the academic world top down. So before we open up to discussions, and I want to just tell you a few things, because I get asked often, Rabbi, would you send your kids to an Ivy League school today? So I'm on the Harvard Jewish Alumni Association. We asked this question offline to Larry Summers. Larry Summers, the former president of Harvard, he's a straight-up guy. He thought about it and he said, not a chance. He said he's very, very white. I mean, he's not exactly, the Rosh Yeshiva. But he said there are staff in the liberal subjects that are gone. And they have tenure. You can't do anything about it. And they think that it's their mission in this world to absolutely drum into kids this idea of critical race theory and how we deserve reparations because we were slaves. Unless I read the wrong Torah, weren't we slaves as well? I don't remember the last phone call to Egypt that we should get. It's insanity. But it's unbelievable. If you've got a generation that's not thinking and you're being bullied and there's cancel culture, but after a while, people realized the momentum was very artificial. And when you break it down, and Baruch Hashem, we also had the bracha of the person running against Trump. I don't know how to say it. It's an empty suit. I mean, it's a joke. So this is obviously Min HaShamayim. Again, what is the relevance for us here at Project Inspire? Never before in all of my years has there been a situation where no matter how far a Jew is, it takes very little to peel back the onion. They know that the whole wokeness is gone. They've seen their best buddy, so death to the Jews. They now know, I better find out about Judaism because, my buddy Mark Christian is now walking around the kafir and he's got a picture of Yasser Arafat. So it's the highest level of confusion, and they're looking for a placeholder for their identity. Social media, completely overwhelming, and there's now such a mental health tsunami that parents are deeply worried. There's obviously done a huge amount of research, and it's the highest percentage of nihilism ever in the history of America. No meaning, no purpose, and they're looking for meaning and purpose. Every human being wants to know why they're in this world. And then finally, we see a groundswell of back to common sense, back to normality, and that's why we're seeing the needle move back to religion. If you converge this all together, it's the perfect storm as to why Donald Trump was the president. More important than Donald Trump being the president is my hope and prayer to all of you, is to understand that what's happened in America today is obviously min hashamayim, in terms of it's the first time that the person in the office 2 doors down that didn't know the difference between a mezuzah and a frisbee, the person that is in your family that has been saying horrible things about your antiquated religion, why you're eating this cardboard, they are as close as they have ever been to being at least receptive, because the alternative has been taken away. They realize the absurdity and the insanity of that world. And they've also seen what happened in America when you defund the police, when you make 27 genders appropriate, and when you have Mr. Goyim running the country. So they are looking. This, I'm telling you, it's without question the most ripe time to ignite the Penteliyid, and my bracha and my hope that each and every one of you will capitalize on this convergence of this perfect storm, and will at least think of 1 or 2 people in your life, because they're ripe, and they're saying it doesn't take special Kirov training. You don't have to know the age of the universe and the dinosaur. You've got to be a mensch. Because there's never, ever been such a lonely generation. It's actually anti-social media. It's caused loneliness. You went from COVID to the highest peak of social media. You went to America's absolutely being drilled off its course. I don't want to be melodramatic, but I do think that if Trump didn't win, it would have been reached the point of no return. If you look what the Torah is saying, that the last bastion, the last place where Jews survived, Edom. So Edom's America. I will tell you as a South African, nobody saw this coming. I grew up in Gan Eden. It's insane. I didn't understand the concept of locking a door when I grew up in South Africa. It was the most beautiful country. You now have a country, the entire backbone of South Africa was built by the Jews. Who was the people that were spearheading the release of Mandela? Arthur Chaskerson was his lawyer, Sidney Kentridge was lawyer, Jews. Who do you think built the Apartheid Museum? It's all Jews. And then you've got this guy, Cyril Ramaphosa. I don't even know if you should say his name in front of Baruch Hashem, no. He's a nutcase. It's complete corruption. Now, if you really want to know what's going on, Cyril Ramaphosa was in the private sector before he became president of South Africa, and his biggest client was Iran. So obviously what happened was, they went bankrupt, the ANC, because they're stealing money for here. And who bailed them out? Iran bailed out the ANC on one condition, that they file a lawsuit in the ICC. So they filed this lawsuit against Israel, which is the most absurd thing. Genocide. And what's happened is, and I spoke to Rabbi Goldstein, the chief rabbi, is the average South African is totally fine. They're not anti-Semites, but at the highest level, it's purely corrupt. They're not doing it because they understand the ideology. They just need money. It's horrific. But what's the lesson for me? I saw growing up the security that I had, the stability during my formative years. I never, ever, nobody saw this coming. So in America, nobody saw a lot of things coming. The highest percentage of anti-Semitism ever. At the end of the day, we're not home. This is really not home. And what I think you see, if you understand Jewish history, is things are happening much, it's very clear. Chazal would say at the end of time, it's like toilet paper. At the end, it just goes quicker. That's exactly what's happening, right? We're at the end of those, and it's insane. I think from one project inspired to the other, it's unbelievable. So there is a compression of time, that says in Sfarim, and then there is and this is a very important thing for you guys to understand, there is, as much as HaKadosh Baruch Hu make it clear that you cannot rely on fallible human beings, you cannot rely on isms, there's only one being in the world that runs the world. If you are intellectually honest, it's impossible to come to the conclusion that things are just happening stamazai. And this is why, before the Mashiach comes, this is the time where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is making it as clearly as possible without taking away people's bechira, that we're not in charge, that the big book, that is the bestseller, was not written by J.K. Rowling, and that this is the time to step up. Why? Because after the Mashiach comes, you're not going to get the chus, and you don't have bechira. It's as clear as can be that why we're here and what our aim is. I'll say this in closing, and we'll take questions. We 0.2% of the world population, but it says in the Torah, it says in the Gemara, it says in many places, we are the nation that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is looking to be the benchmark of morality, of integrity. We are we are not only the Or L'Goyim, we have to be the Or to our disenfranchised Jews as well. At the end of the day, the tail wags the dog. The small percentage of Jews, which are the people in this room, Kaviyochel HaKadosh Baruch Hu is relying on to disseminate the fact that it's not an antiquated book about two zebras going up to an ark. It's the instructions for living. It's the instructions to living a wholesome. It's not a guarantee that nothing in your life will ever happen that's scary, that's freaky, because that's a lie. When people in the Kiruv world say, get involved in Yiddishkeit and your problems go away, it's not true. Okay, it means that you have the best system that is in the world of how to meet your significant other, how to bring up a family, of how to balance your life. There's nothing like it. So it's out there, it's real. Every single one of you are the ambassadors of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Be'ez Hashem, take the baton that's been handed to you and use that flame to ignite the Pintel Yid. Now, disenfranchised brothers and sisters, I wish everyone gesund, brocha, only good things. And Be'ez Hashem, next year, Project Inspired will be in Yerushalayim, Ira Kodesh. Questions, thoughts, tomatoes? Yes, sir.
One is, what do the Torah codes say about the future?
Brilliant. I was hoping. Okay. So the way the Torah codes never prognosticate. They never prognosticate, meaning you can't go to the Torah and start figuring out the future. Obviously, Hashem wouldn't do that. So we didn't know. No one knew that someone was going to try and assassinate Trump, right? Once that happened, they went into the Torah codes and they saw Trump's name and they were able to break out the assassin's name, etc. But you can't prognosticate. That's I have to clarify that. That's not how the Torah codes work. Sorry? The assassin's name. Yeah, I'll show you this page. And anything, by the way, I want you guys can email me, my numbers on Torah anytime, whatever. The three ring circles that we discussed is there, and what it means, and what the convergence, the Torah, whatever you want. I feel that I don't want you to hear something and not be able to research it yourself and snoop it and schmoop and make sure that it's all emes. But also, this is stuff that you're definitely not going to get on mainstream media. But it's just again, Torah codes don't prognosticate the future. If we know certain variables, we can look into the place where those names are, and through equidistant space, you'll see that it's very clear that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had moved the chessboard around.
The other question is that you say that the Mishnah Chanan has, you peel it away, and you can be able to see that before the child was born.
Yep.
It's in their DNA, and they have the Mishnah Chanan.
Yep.
More than a non-Jew. Why is it that most of this deep state or this
Very good.
or this cancel culture is, like you said in South Africa, we're Jews?
So why are you saying why are most Jews not religious, basically?
No, not even worse. They're the ones that started.
Brilliant question. You hear the question? Why is it that the leaders of the woke movement are very... Okay, excellent question. So there's two things. Firstly, in the Kiruv world, about 10, 12 years ago, myself and Mordechai Becher wrote an article called Spiritual Triage. What spiritual triage means, we know we have limited resources and limited time. What's the most judicious use of our time? I don't know if it's... Okay, we're saying on Torah time, but why is it that we focus on young people, college people, and and most of our focus is on unmarried people? Why do you think that is? Because as you move on, okay, firstly in terms of age, as you move on in life, you've got to understand the more years that you are eating treif, for example. There's a timtum alev. there's a desensitization. There's like a soot that is created around the neshama, which makes it a lot harder to break into. So it's very hard to break into an 80-year-old, and you've got to understand it's very clear in the Torah. I can show you the makor, that person who's eating treif, it's a spiritual desensitization. So that's the age. Why is it that the Jews are the people that are leading Mandela, leading the woke? So a Jewish neshama is wired to, they understand that there's an expectation. We are the most ideological people in terms of, Tikkun Olam has been taken completely out of context by the Reform and Reconstruction. We've got to save the whales, the world. That's not what it means. But the drive for excellence, the drive to transcend, that's based on, that is supposed to be directed towards Torah. If it's not directed towards Torah, they'll find some source. When I wrote an article called "Will Your Grandchild Be Jewish?" many years ago. Part of that research, I had to call the head of cults, the Moonies. It was hysterical. The head of every single cult was Jewish. The head of the Moonies, this is Goldberg. And when you ask why, every Jew is searching. Do you understand how many Jews are right now levitating in Tibet? I spoke in Panama. Panama's become a big place where after the Israelis have finished their thing, they go around the world, whatever. They're searching. That was one of the comments of the other speakers. The days of Meir Schuster Zatzal, and when people were backpacking and searching, that's gone because social media and other things has flattened that. But there is every single Yiddish neshama is unsettled. They're looking, they know, because they're hardwired, they're looking for the emes while we hear purpose, and a lot of them get it wrong. Do you know there's 250,000 Jew-boos in America? Jewish Buddhists. 250,000 Jew-boos. So one of my fellow South Africans, Akiva Tats, wrote a book on this. It's searching. They're searching for spirituality. They're searching for meaning. Every Jew is wired to know we're not here to collect toys and then win the rat race. They understand that.
Why are they the leaders? Why are they the ones that...
That's inculcated into the deep DNA of the Yiddish neshama, is that they are going to be people that want to make the world a better place. If you are not harnessed and directed through Torah, because that's the way to make the world a better place, they are going to be the leaders of every ism, every single ism. Who are the four people in the 20th century that made the biggest change ever? 3 of them are Jews, and the one was wrong. Sigmund Freud, Albert Einstein, Charles Darwin, who was wrong. It's all the Jews. It's the Jews. I can tell you at Harvard, the biggest leaders of the free, it's all Jews. That's why a Jewish neshama is driven to make the world a better place, to be a leader. That's how God made us. And when people say we are different, fundamentally different to you know how many times I remember the late Esther Jungras. Right. So I tell you one of the things that when I get, a lot of us get involved in situations when someone's engaged, whatever, to shiksa, how do you break that up? So I mean, there's old, like your parents and the grandparents, the Holocaust, that never works. I tell you what has worked many times. When I've said to a person, and it's absolutely true, do you realize I'm telling you as a rabbi, with a yarmulke on my head, and you can put this in writing, I promise you, you are not marrying your soulmate. It's impossible. Your soulmate. It's absolutely impossible if you're marrying a guy who's not going to be a convert. It's impossible to be your soulmate. It gets people a little bit confused, and that starts the conversation. My point being that we're fundamentally different. Our tafkid in this world, our drive in this world, Jews are why are we at the top at everything? Jews are much more driven. They understand that there's definitely an unease that Jews have had. Less Jews are going to sit and retire and do nothing. We are just built differently. If it's not harnessed through the Torah to make a world a better place pursuant to the Tariq mitzvahs, they will find a place where they can give expression to that. Otherwise, they'll go out of their mind.
Isn't that better? George Soros thinks, let's say...
George Soros thinks George Soros,
He is funding...
I promise you right now, if you put a lie detector on George Soros, right, and ask him whether he thinks he's doing the right thing, 100% he thinks he's doing the right thing. He's nuts. People get mixed up. Being a Russia doesn't mean being nuts, right? The fact that he's a nutcase and the fact that he's completely off doesn't mean that he, in his mind's eye, is not l'shem shemaim. If it's not harnessed the right way, you'll take the same spiritual DNA, the same spiritual horsepower, and it'll go off. The head of the cults, they're all Jews. That's the reason.
You said that our soulmate, our wife, is not necessarily our...
No, I'm saying very clearly. I'm saying if you are marrying a Gentile that is not a convert, it's impossible for that person to be your soulmate. Impossible.
Is it possible that she would divorce after they continue to summer?
Long discussion. L'choira, you are, the reason it's not supposed to be, right, that the reason why you're converting is because it's out of love or out of relationship. That's one of the reasons why the Beis Din, if you come to be a Gior, they'll push back because they don't want to, that's one of the reasons. I will say something else because I can see it's bothering people. I get this often about Zivug Rishon, Zivug Sheni. So I'll just tell you like this. Ploni bas Ploni, before a person's born, the Gemara says very clearly that this soul is destined to marry that soul. Here's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu does, okay? HaKadosh Baruch Hu will make sure that you cross paths with Rivka at some point in your life. You're still a Bechira. If you have a bad cold and Sudafed and you're not thinking straight, you can miss it. But Hashem loves you, and He wants you to spend your life with the person that is going to be Masakin your neshama. Whatever you need to be, the traits that you need to modify, that you need to work on, the perfect match. That's why you'll never marry your clone, and that's why I get in the first year of marriage, at least half the guys, I get the call, which I've told people, Rabbi Gordon, I've got to speak to you alone. That's how the call comes. I'm very quiet. I have to speak to you alone. I don't know what's coming. I go out to Starbucks and there's silence, and I married the wrong person. At least half the guys. Because people are built up thinking that marriage is easy. It's Disneyland. You're taking someone with a different gender, a different culture, a different proclivities. Hashem hides certain things. What do you think? Shalom Bayis doesn't mean that you're perfect in sync. Shalom Bayis, despite your differences, despite the fact that you're able to create, Shalom is one of Hashem's names and a repository for the Shekhinah to dwell. That's what Shalom Bayis is. It's very tough. The best example I can give is what gives anyone who's a parent here, what gives parents the most pleasure? Their kids, right? What gives them the most pain? Their kids. What does that tell you? HaKadosh Baruch Hu's made it. The secular world said that a happy life is a pain-free life. That's very destructive. A happy life is a pain-free life. That is true. But it's more than that. That's a hallmark card. All of your bracha comes through your wife. When I speak to guys that are flying around the world on private jets and their wife, I know that their wife is miserable. They don't spend... At some point, it's going to backfire. Hashem doesn't joke. It's made it very, very clear. The bracha comes from your wife. Because women don't struggle with ego, with testosterone, with alpha, but they don't have that. So we have to be told that your panosa comes from, because men, because of wanting to feel good about our identity, we want to be matzliach financially. If I was to announce a shir in the JP Morgan about... understanding shatnez. There'll be one person in the front row who's probably the janitor. If I announce a shir, the segula to becoming rich, you guaranteed you can. I know that's how men think about panos, and they should. That's a lot of their identity. So that's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu made saying, take care of your significant other. It's very against it's a natural thing for a woman to be altruistic, to be selfless. It's very hard for men. So that's why don't women, mitzvahs time-bound mitzvahs, why don't they have time-bound mitzvahs? When we say in the bracha, I get all these debates saying that it means that women are subservient. It's unequivocally clear in the Torah that women are on a higher level than us. Unequivocally clear. Look at all the Meforshim when it says, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Avram, bend down and listen to your wife. It doesn't mean that your wife has to be shorter than you. I'll give you a true story. The Bina and Yisera of a woman, we don't have this. I have to walk the talk. There's an extremely wealthy guy in LA who wants to partner with me in one of these Malibu houses, Malibu palaces. So I go with my wife on a Sunday. He's got a cable car down to his house, 3 Ferraris, 17 Bentleys. His butler's got a butler. Picasso's a fly. It's ridiculous. Spent some time there. It was great. We're driving out of the house, and my wife's just going like this. So I'm saying, did I miss something? She said, I can't put my finger on it. I don't like him. I don't want you to partner with him. So I got to walk the talk. I didn't. 6 weeks later, a skeleton fell out of the closet that if Chas v'Shalom I'd partnered with him, I would never have seen it. Because that's the gift that Hashem's given a woman. It's complete. It's very hard for why is a woman able to wake up even before the baby cries to nurse? Different. I used to be a woman, so it's a whole different discussion. But anything else, guys? That's true. Yes. It's not. We'll talk about it offline. Tell me what the source is. The Kabbalah Center teaches that. It's Krum. It's Kfira. Amen.